In a town where tradition weighed heavy and reputation meant everything, Judge Malcolm Denton had built a career on being the embodiment of order, discipline, and morality. His was a face that appeared on campaign posters and Sunday sermons and on courthouse steps when he spoke about the importance of family values. At 58, he had become the kind of man people whispered about with both admiration and fear. Admiration for the power he wielded, fear because one wrong move in his courtroom could decide the fate of a life. To the outside world, he was a beacon of integrity. Inside his sprawling brick home, however, a different story was unfolding, one that would expose not just cracks in the facade, but an abyss so deep it would swallow everything he had worked for. His only son, Ethan Denton, was 21 and in many ways a mirror image of his father. Bright, charismatic, studying law with the expectation of someday following in the family footsteps. But Ethan carried a secret that didn't align with the carefully crafted image Judge Denton projected. Ethan was gay, something he had hidden from most of his family, and certainly from the man who had spent years preaching about traditional values from both the bench and the pulpit of public opinion. It wasn't that Ethan was ashamed. He had friends, even someone he was beginning to call more than a friend. But he knew his father, and he knew the fallout if the truth ever surfaced. That fear became reality one humid night when a video, grainy but unmistakable, began circulating online. It was Ethan, intimate, vulnerable, a moment he had never consented to share beyond the person he trusted. Within hours, whispers spread across campus, then across town. In a community as conservative as theirs, it was more than scandalous. It was explosive. And for Judge Denton, the man who had spent decades sculpting a persona of moral superiority, it was catastrophic. Overnight, headlines weren't about his rulings or his campaign for higher office. They were about his son and a sex tape that called everything into question. Neighbors tried to act polite, but eyes lingered longer at the grocery store. Colleagues in the courthouse exchanged tight smiles, the kind that carried judgment underneath. Denton's political advisors were blunt. If the story stuck, his future was finished. He would never climb higher than the bench he sat on. For a man obsessed with legacy, that kind of humiliation was unbearable. What hurt even more was that he couldn't control the narrative. The internet had no gavel, no courtroom decorum. Once something leaked, it lived forever. Inside the Denton home, the atmosphere turned suffocating. Ethan, who had always carried himself with confidence, now felt the walls close in. He tried to explain to his father that he was the victim, that someone had betrayed him, that being gay wasn't a crime. But Judge Denton didn't want explanations. He wanted silence. He wanted the tape gone, the shame erased. He shouted about disgrace, about headlines, about what donors would think, about how Ethan had ruined everything. It wasn't the voice of a father. It was the voice of a man protecting an empire of lies. Friends who spoke to Ethan during those days remembered him as conflicted. He wasn't broken, not exactly, but he was furious that the one person who should have loved him without condition seemed to see him only as a liability. If he thinks this is the end of me, he's wrong, Ethan told friend. But what Ethan didn't know, what nobody could have guessed, was that his father wasn't just panicking. He was calculating. He was already envisioning a way to turn this scandal into something tragic but respectable, something that would protect his reputation, even if it meant destroying the very life he was sworn to cherish. That summer night, as the scandal swelled beyond the Denton front yard, few could imagine that the man they trusted to uphold justice would soon commit an act so monstrous it would send shockwaves far beyond their small town. And at the center of it all was a son who wanted nothing more than to live authentically, and a father who would rather see him dead than see his own legacy tainted. This is the story of how a judge, one who had built his life on condemning others, became the ultimate criminal in the desperate bid to bury a truth he could not face. The first cracks in Judge Malcolm Denton's carefully built empire came not from the courts or the ballot box, but from whispers that traveled faster than any gavel could silence. At first, it was quiet, an offhand comment in the hallway of the courthouse, a stifled laugh outside the grocery store, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Ethan's video had spread beyond the borders of campus gossip. It had gone public, and with it, the Denton name was dragged into a storm Judge Denton could neither control nor contain. He had spent decades cultivating an image of strict conservatism, standing on stages denouncing moral decay and warning about how society was losing its values. Every speech, every ruling he delivered in court carried the undertone of righteousness. That was his currency. It was how he secured donors, how he held his grip on power, and how he positioned himself for the congressional run his advisors had been quietly planning. And now, in the space of a few days, that currency was crumbling into dust. For Ethan, the exposure felt like suffocation. Friends described him as angry more than ashamed. Angry that his privacy had been violated, angry that he had become the centerpiece of town gossip, and angrier still that his father seemed less concerned about his pain and more about his own reputation. He wanted comfort. He wanted his father to tell him it would be okay. Instead, what he got was a man pacing the living room, veins bulging, fists clenching as he muttered about embarrassment and the ruin of everything I've worked for. In one of their last arguments witnessed by the household staff, Ethan shouted, "I'm not ashamed of who I am. You are." His words cut through the Denton home like glass shattering. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the judge's deep, labored breathing. Then came the rage. "You think this is about you?" Denton roared. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me? What you've cost this family?" But family didn't mean Ethan. It meant Denton himself, his career, his name. Every glance from a neighbor, every sideways look from a colleague only reinforced the gnawing fear in his chest, that the life he had constructed would collapse under the weight of scandal. Behind closed doors, Denton was frantic. He called in favors with local reporters, trying to bury the story, but the internet didn't bend to backroom deals. He tried leaning on a friend in the state attorney's office, but the tape wasn't criminal. It was humiliating. He hired a private investigator to track the leak, but even that didn't stop the slow drip of shame. No matter what he tried, the video remained, shared and reshared, a permanent stain on his carefully ironed image. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself under constant surveillance, not by strangers, but by his own father. His calls were monitored, his movements questioned. Denton would burst into his room unannounced, demanding to know who he was texting, who he was meeting. Ethan told friends he felt like a prisoner in his own home. One night, over drinks with a confidant, he said bitterly, "My dad cares more about his campaign than he does about me being alive." The gulf between them widened with every passing day. Ethan leaned into his friends, his partner, the life he wanted to live. Denton retreated into his study, surrounded by leather-bound law books and old photographs, as though the image of the stern patriarch might somehow shield him from the truth unraveling outside. But the outside world wasn't kind. A local columnist published a thinly veiled editorial about the hypocrisy of those who preach morality but can't manage their own households. Though Denton's name wasn't printed, everyone knew who it referred to. Television pundits began speculating on whether the judge's future in politics was irreparably damaged. Donors pulled back, their calls suddenly going unanswered. The more Denton tried to hold the pieces together, the faster they fell apart. His once commanding presence in the courtroom now seemed fragile. Lawyers who once feared his sharp tongue now watched with thinly veiled amusement as his temper flared over minor objections. Jurors whispered. Clerks avoided eye contact. The authority he wielded had been punctured. For Ethan, the weight of it all was crushing, but not in the way people assumed. He wasn't drowning in shame. He was suffocating under his father's rage and control. He began spending more nights away from home, crashing on couches, seeking spaces where he could breathe without judgment. But every time he returned, the tension only grew. Denton would lecture him late into the night about duty and responsibility, phrases that sounded less like guidance and more like threats. The town saw only the surface, a respected judge struggling with a personal tragedy. But behind the doors of that stately brick house, the story was darker. Denton wasn't just worried about scandal. He was consumed by it. Every headline, every rumor, every whispered insult fanned a fire inside him, a fire fueled by pride, fear, and the belief that he could still control the narrative if only he acted decisively enough. What neither Ethan nor the public could see was that Denton's desperation was hardening into something dangerous. This wasn't just about shame anymore, it was about survival. And as the walls closed in, the judge began to imagine solutions not in terms of law or justice, but in the cold, irreversible calculus of silence. Judge Malcolm Denon had always believed that every problem had a solution, provided you were willing to make the hard choices. It was how he had risen from a small-town prosecutor to one of the most respected judges in the state. But the scandal surrounding his son wasn't like the messy cases he presided over in court. This one was personal, visceral, and, to him, humiliating. It couldn't be argued away or dismissed with a ruling. The more he tried to fight it through legal channels, the more it seemed to grow, like a wildfire feeding on oxygen. And so, in the quiet of his study, Denton began to consider the unthinkable. If Ethan could not be silenced, perhaps the scandal could be buried with him. It began innocently enough, or at least that's what Denton told himself. He spent long hours scrolling through articles on the psychology of suicide, reading about common methods, notes left behind, the patterns investigators looked for. He rationalized it as research, a way to understand how the public might interpret Ethan's growing stress. But the deeper he went, the more the line blurred between understanding and planning. Soon he was printing out articles about ligature marks, staging suicide scenes, and how digital evidence could make or break an investigation. Late at night, with a tumbler of whiskey sweating on his desk, Denton mapped out scenarios. If Ethan were to jump from a nearby bridge, it might draw too much attention. A car crash could leave too many variables outside his control. But suicide in one's own bedroom, quiet, tragic, and tragically believable, fit perfectly. A young man humiliated by a leaked video, overwhelmed by pressure, finally breaking under the weight. The narrative practically wrote itself. Denton could already hear the sympathetic murmurs. Poor boy, he just couldn't take it anymore. He began laying groundwork. One afternoon, while Ethan was at class, Denton carefully entered his son's laptop. As a judge, he had contacts who understood digital forensics, but he didn't need them for this. He needed only a few sentences typed into a Word document. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry for letting everyone down. Maybe now Dad can move on. He saved it under Ethan's personal folder, time-stamped it, then quietly deleted the original. To the average eye, it would appear genuine. Denton also started purchasing supplies, rope, gloves, even a small lockbox to keep it all hidden in the garage. He paid in cash, driving several towns over to avoid recognition. The meticulousness that had served him in court now guided him through the logistics of murder. Every step was cataloged, rehearsed, until he felt he could stage the scene blindfolded. Meanwhile, Ethan sensed something shifting in the atmosphere at home. His father was quieter during the day, but at night, the intensity returned. He caught Denton watching him with a strange mix of sorrow and calculation, as if weighing the boy against the man's ambitions. Ethan told his boyfriend during a hushed phone call, "He's scaring me. It's like he's planning something, but I can't figure out what." The truth was closer than Ethan imagined. Denton had already begun planting seeds with those around him. To his colleagues at the courthouse, he mentioned how worried he was about Ethan's mental state. To a neighbor, he shook his head and sighed. That boy hasn't been the same since the video. It was all part of a subtle campaign, designed so that when the worst happened, no one would question it too deeply. Still, a part of him wrestled with hesitation. On more than one occasion, he sat across from Ethan at the dinner table, watching his son's hands tremble as he cut into his food, and felt a pang of guilt. But that guilt was quickly buried beneath layers of fear. Fear of exposure, fear of ruin, fear of losing the very thing he valued most, his name. Pride, as it had so often in his life, outweighed compassion. His paranoia grew. He started monitoring Ethan's phone, installing tracking software without his son's knowledge. When Ethan confronted him about the sudden restrictions, why his bank card had been frozen, why his car keys were missing, Denton exploded, framing it as protection. But in reality, it was control. He needed Ethan contained, predictable, manageable. The plan crystallized in his mind, a confrontation staged late at night when the house was quiet. He would enter Ethan's room, restrain him, and stage the suicide. The suicide note would be discovered on his laptop. The timing would line up perfectly with the emotional turmoil everyone already suspected. And Denton, the grieving father, would deliver a performance of sorrow so convincing it would mask the monster underneath. What Denton didn't account for, however, was Ethan's growing defiance. The boy wasn't planning to disappear quietly. He told friends he was tired of living in his father's shadow, tired of hiding who he was, tired of being treated like a stain on the family name. "If he thinks he can silence me, he's wrong," Ethan declared one night. Those words would never reach Denton's ears, but they marked a dangerous shift because the collision course between father and son was now inevitable. By the time Denton placed the coiled rope into the hidden lockbox, his decision was made. There was no turning back. He would not allow a scandal to consume him. He would not permit a single tape to undo decades of power and influence. In his mind, Ethan's death was not murder. It was preservation, a necessary sacrifice to protect everything Judge Malcolm Denton believed he was owed. And so, with his plan rehearsed and his mind hardened, the countdown began. What Ethan thought was just the suffocating weight of shame and control was, in truth, the prelude to a crime so cold and calculated it would shock not only their town but the nation. Denton had set his course. All that remained was the night he would carry it out. The night Judge Malcolm Denton chose to put his plan into action was unremarkable to anyone else. It was a Thursday, humid and still, the kind of evening where cicadas droned in the trees and porch lights flickered against a thick curtain of darkness. Inside the Denton home, the quiet seemed almost deliberate, as though the walls themselves knew what was about to happen. For weeks, the judge had rehearsed this moment in his mind. Now, as the clock ticked toward midnight, he moved with a cold, steady purpose. Ethan had retreated to his room hours earlier. His headphones were on, music muffled but audible through the door. He had spent the evening texting his boyfriend, venting about the latest argument with his father. "He's obsessed," Ethan wrote. "I can't breathe in this house anymore. If it weren't for him watching me, I'd be gone already." Those messages would later serve as haunting proof that Ethan was not suicidal. But in that moment, they were just the words of a young man trying to cope. Denton stood outside the door, a pair of leather gloves already pulled tight against his hands. In his mind, he repeated the story he would tell the police. Ethan had been withdrawn, ashamed, unable to handle the pressure. The note on his laptop would confirm it. The rope in the garage would seal the image of a young man who had taken his own life. He convinced himself he wasn't murdering his son. He was protecting his family, his career, his name. When he finally pushed open the door, Ethan looked up, startled. "Dad, what are you doing?" he asked, pulling off his headphones. Denton's expression was unreadable, but his presence was heavy. He closed the door behind him with a quiet click. "We need to talk," the judge said, his voice low and steady. Ethan sighed, already exhausted by weeks of tension. "If this is about the tape again, I don't want to hear it. I didn't do anything wrong." "You ruined everything," Denton snapped, the calm facade breaking. "Do you understand what you've done to me? To this family? People are laughing at me in my own courthouse. My career, everything I've built, is burning because of you." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Because of me? Or because of who you are? You care more about what people think than you do about your own son." The word stung, but Denton's pride wouldn't let him show it. He stepped closer, towering over his son. "I gave you everything. I set you on the path to law school, to a life most kids your age could only dream of. And this is how you repay me? With shame." Ethan rose from his chair, meeting his father's glare head-on. "I'm not ashamed of being gay. You are. That's the problem. You'd rather have a dead son than a gay one, wouldn't you?" For a fleeting second, Denton hesitated. His son's eyes, so full of fire, so determined, reminded him of his younger self, the man who had clawed his way into power. But instead of pride, all he felt was rage. The thought of that fire turning against him, threatening to expose him further, made his decision final. Without another word, Denon lunged. Ethan tried to fight back, shoving his father, shouting, "Get off me!" The struggle knocked over a lamp, plunging the room into shadows broken only by the glow of the computer screen. Ethan swung wildly, landing a fist against his father's jaw, but Denton was stronger, fueled by desperation. He grabbed his son by the throat, squeezing until Ethan's shouts turned into choked gasps. The sounds of a struggle were muffled by the thick walls of the house, the kind of home built to insulate against both weather and prying ears. Ethan's fingernails raked at his father's arms, leaving deep scratches, but Denton didn't loosen his grip. He pressed harder, eyes locked on his son's, until finally Ethan's body went limp. The silence that followed was deafening. Breathing heavily, Denton stood over the lifeless form of his son. For a moment, the weight of what he had done pressed against his chest, threatening to crush him. But then the judge in him, the man who had always thought in terms of appearances, narratives, and outcomes, took over. He forced himself into action. He retrieved the rope from the lockbox in the garage, looping it with mechanical precision. He lifted Ethan's body, straining under the dead weight, and positioned it against the closet beam. He tied the knots carefully, making sure they mimicked the diagrams he had studied. The scene was grotesque, but to Denton, it was artifice, an illusion designed to convince the world of a lie. Next, he opened Ethan's laptop. The note he had planted weeks earlier waited, a fabricated cry for help. He read it once more, convincing himself it would be enough. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry for letting everyone down." He left the screen glowing, as though Ethan had written it moments before taking his life. By the time he stepped back, the room looked exactly as he had imagined. To a casual observer, it was the tragic end of a young man pushed too far. To Denton, it was a shield, a way to redirect the eyes of the public, to turn whispers of scandal into murmurs of sympathy. When the police arrived hours later, called by Denton himself in a performance of grief, the house was bathed in flashing red and blue. Officers moved cautiously through the scene, their faces somber. One of them, Detective Marcy Lowell, lingered longer than the others. She studied the rope, the bruising, the faint signs of struggle that didn't quite match the story. But Denton's reputation preceded him, and her colleagues seemed eager to close the case quickly. "It looks like suicide," one officer muttered. Denton nodded, his voice hoarse but steady. "I tried to help him. God knows I tried. But he couldn't handle it." He buried his face in his hands, letting the sobs come, calculated, rehearsed, yet convincing enough to fool everyone in the room. Outside, neighbors gathered, whispering about the tragedy. The judge's son, gone too soon. The shame of the tape, the unbearable pressure, all culminating in this. It was the story Denon had wanted them to believe, and for now, they did. But behind the staged grief and the carefully crafted scene, tiny cracks remained, scratches on his arms, inconsistencies in the timeline, details too small for most to notice. Detective Lowell noticed. She didn't say it out loud that night, but the unease in her chest told her this wasn't over. For Judge Denton, though, the act was complete. He had silenced his son, buried the scandal, and protected his name, at least for the moment. What he didn't know was that the very evidence he thought he had destroyed, the digital ghosts on Ethan's laptop, would come back to haunt him. And when they did, the story would turn from tragedy to horror, exposing the man who wore the robe of justice as nothing more than a murderer in disguise. Detective Marcy Lowell had worked enough cases to know when something didn't sit right. On paper, the death of Ethan Denon was tragic but straightforward. A young man, humiliated by the release of a sex tape, overcome by shame, took his own life. The note left on his laptop seemed to confirm it. His father, Judge Malcolm Denton, was a respected figure who had done everything he could to support his son. At least, that was the story. But the more Lowell studied the scene, the more it felt like pieces of a puzzle forced together where they didn't belong. She had arrived at the Denton house just after 1 a.m. The judge was already in full performance. Red eyes, a trembling voice, insisting through sobs that he had failed his boy. To the officers on scene, it was convincing. To Lowell, it was a little too convincing. She noticed how quickly he offered explanations, how he repeated the same lines, almost rehearsed. She also noticed the scratches on his forearms. When asked, he said he got them trying to cut Ethan down, but something about the angle and depth of the marks seemed inconsistent with that story. She filed the detail away in her notebook without comment. The room itself told another story. Lowell examined the closet where Ethan's body had been found. The rope was tied in a knot more intricate than she had ever seen in her years investigating suicides. It looked deliberate, methodical, almost practiced. Suicide scenes often carried the chaos of desperation. This one carried precision. She crouched down near the desk where the laptop still glowed. The note was short, simple, almost too neat. Most notes she had read in her career were rambling, emotional, filled with fragments and second guesses. This one read like it had been drafted for an audience. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. She needed evidence. In the days that followed, Lowell quietly began piecing together Ethan's final weeks. She spoke to his friends, classmates, anyone who might shed light on his state of mind. Again and again, she heard the same thing. Ethan had been upset, yes, but not broken. He had made jokes about moving away, starting fresh somewhere his father's name didn't weigh him down. He was angry, one friend said, but he wasn't suicidal. He wanted to fight back, not give up. Ethan's boyfriend, a fellow student named Marco, was even more direct. He told me flat out, "I'm not going to let my dad win." Those were his words. He was scared of him, detective. He said his father would do anything to make the problem disappear. Lowell pressed him for details, and Marco reluctantly admitted Ethan believed his father was monitoring his phone, controlling his accounts, keeping him under surveillance. He thought his dad was losing it, Marco whispered. Honestly, I think he was right. Back at the precinct, Lowell couldn't shake the feeling something was off about the note. It felt too polished, too staged. That was not the behavior of spontaneous suicide note. That was planning. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the report. Someone had planted this. Someone had thought ahead. Lowell returned to the physical evidence. Photographs of Ethan's body revealed faint bruising on his arms, the kind that came from struggling, from trying to fight someone off. The ligature marks on his neck were uneven, more consistent with manual strangulation before suspension. To most eyes, the differences were subtle. To Lowell, they were glaring. She brought her concerns to her superior, but he hesitated. "This is Judge Denton we're talking about," he reminded her. "You'd better be damn sure before you accuse a man like that of killing his own son." Lowell understood the politics. Denton wasn't just any judge. He was powerful, connected, and feared. But she also knew the truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface, and right now, it was scratching at the edges of this case. The turning point came when she revisited the scratches on Denton's arms. She ordered them photographed and compared to Ethan's fingernails, which had been clipped during autopsy. The patterns matched perfectly. Ethan had fought back. That alone shattered the suicide narrative. Yet Lowell still lacked the smoking gun. She needed something irrefutable, something digital that couldn't be explained away. She went back to the laptop, this time focusing on internet activity. The forensics team traced the upload of Ethan's sex tape to a specific IP address. When they matched it against records, Lowell's stomach turned. The address didn't belong to Ethan. It belonged to the Denton household, and specifically to the judge's study. It was almost unthinkable. The man who had wept on his knees the night of his son's death wasn't just a grieving father. He was the one who had put the scandal in motion, uploading the very video that destroyed his son's life, then killing him to bury the fallout. Lowell didn't rush. She knew the weight of what she had uncovered. But as she pieced together the timeline, Denton discovering Ethan's secret, uploading the tape, creating the fake suicide note, staging the scene, the picture was undeniable. It wasn't just a father desperate to protect his name. It was a calculated execution. She sat alone in her office late one evening, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows. On her wall were photos. Ethan smiling with friends, Ethan's lifeless body hanging in his room, Denton standing at the courthouse steps, proud and powerful. The contrast was unbearable. For the first time, Lowell allowed herself to whisper the truth aloud. The judge killed his own son. And with that acknowledgement came a new challenge: how to bring down a man who had built his entire life on being untouchable. The break came not from a witness or a confession, but from the silent hum of a hard drive. Ethan Denton's laptop, sealed in an evidence bag, had already revealed inconsistencies with the so-called suicide note. But Detective Marcy Lowell knew machines carried deeper truths, digital ghosts that lingered even when someone tried to erase them. She requested a full forensic recovery, the kind that went beyond surface files and dug into the bones of the machine itself. The process took days. Technicians combed through hidden directories, caches, fragments of deleted files. On the sixth day, one of them called her into the lab. "Detective, you need to see this." On the screen was a series of logs, internet activity buried beneath layers of deletion. The IP address trail she had already suspected was there, but what stunned her was the user history. The first upload of Ethan's sex tape, the one that detonated his life, hadn't been sent from Ethan's dorm Wi-Fi or a stranger's device. It came from the Denton residence. More specifically, the login credentials tied it to Judge Malcolm Denton's private study. Lowell felt the air drain from her chest. The implications were staggering. The judge hadn't just reacted to the scandal. He had manufactured it. He had weaponized his son's vulnerability, uploaded the tape himself to create the very humiliation he then used as a motive for suicide. It was the cruelest irony imaginable: a father orchestrating his son's downfall in order to later erase him. The technicians dug deeper. They recovered fragments of emails, drafts never sent. In one, Denton had written lines that mirrored the suicide note later found on Ethan's laptop. "I'm sorry I let everyone down. I can't go on." The timestamp showed it had been composed weeks before Ethan's death, in the same word program Denton often used for his legal rulings. The document had been copied onto Ethan's computer under a different user account. Lowell stared at the evidence, each line of data like a knife carving into the judge's carefully constructed facade. "He didn't just kill him," she murmured. "He scripted the whole thing." The next step was verification. She couldn't afford loopholes, not against a man as powerful and connected as Judge Denton. She brought in an independent digital forensics expert, someone outside the local chain of command, to confirm the findings. Within 48 hours, the report came back airtight. The video upload originated from Denton's machine, the suicide note had been pre-written and planted, and the deletion patterns showed deliberate tampering. When Lowell looked at the growing case file spread across her desk, she realized what she had: motive, method, and means. Denton's motive was crystal clear: protect his reputation. The method was equally chilling: humiliate his son, push him into a corner, then stage his death. And the means? Every keystroke, every digital fingerprint pointed back to him. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. Buried in the recover drive was a hidden folder of video files. Most were mundane court recordings Denton had stored, but one stood out: a raw, uncompressed version of Ethan's sex tape, time-stamped days before it was ever leaked online. Lowell's hands trembled as she clicked play. There was Ethan, unaware he was being destroyed by the very person meant to protect him. The file's metadata confirmed it had been copied from Ethan's phone, which meant only someone with direct access could have obtained it. Denton hadn't just stumbled across the tape. He had stolen it. The revelation reframed everything. The scandal wasn't an accident. It was a weapon. Denton had deliberately taken the most intimate part of his son's life, exposed it to the world, and then used the fallout as justification for murder. It was cruelty layered on cruelty, abuse disguised as righteousness. Lowell sat in silence for a long time after watching the file. Outside her office window, the courthouse lights glowed against the night sky. She thought about all the years Denton had stood in that very building, passing judgment on others, lecturing about morality. Now she had proof that the judge himself was the most depraved criminal of them all. The challenge was bringing him down. She knew Denton's influence stretched deep: colleagues, politicians, law enforcement officers who owed him favors. If word of the investigation leaked too soon, He could bury it, twist it, maybe even destroy the evidence before it reached court. Lowell decided she needed to move strategically. She built her case file layer by layer, documenting every step so there would be no cracks for a defense attorney to exploit. Meanwhile, Denon carried on in public as though nothing had changed. He gave interviews about the tragedy of suicide, spoke at a local church about the need to support struggling youth, and even announced he was still considering a congressional run. Cameras captured him wiping tears from his eyes as he talked about Ethan. The town saw a grieving father. Lowell saw a killer rehearsing his role. The dam broke when she subpoenaed Denton's home internet provider. The log showed multiple late-night uploads from his study in the weeks before Ethan's death, all routed to anonymous servers. One of those uploads matched exactly the file hash of Ethan's leaked video. Digital fingerprints don't lie. Denon had left a trail straight to his door. With this, Lowell convened a quiet meeting with the district attorney. She laid out the evidence: the pre-written note, the upload logs, the scratches on Denon's arms, the inconsistencies in the ligature marks, and now the raw video file on his drive. The DA, initially hesitant, sat in stunned silence. "If we move on this," he said finally, "we're not just arresting a judge. We're detonating a political bomb." Lowell's response was simple: "Then let it blow. His son deserves the truth." Plans were set in motion for an arrest warrant. Lowell insisted it be executed publicly, so there would be no chance for Denon to claim conspiracy or cover up. She wanted the world to see the man who had cloaked himself in law and morality exposed for what he was. In the weeks ahead, as preparations were made, Lowell kept one image seared into her mind: the recovered video file, proof of Ethan's trust betrayed by his own father. It wasn't just evidence. It was the voice of the victim, crying out from beyond the grave. And soon, that voice would thunder in a courtroom, shattering the illusion Judge Malcolm Denton had spent a lifetime building. The morning of the arrest began like any other in the Denton courthouse. Lawyers shuffled papers in the hallway, clerks hurried from office to office, and the familiar echo of heels on marble floors filled the air. Judge Malcolm Denton walked in wearing his black robe, head held high, the picture of dignity. To those who didn't know better, he looked like a man still carrying the weight of grief, but pushing forward with duty. To Detective Marcy Lowell, who stood waiting in the back of the courtroom with a warrant folded in her jacket, he looked like a man moments away from his empire crumbling. The courtroom filled quickly. Denton was presiding over a high-profile fraud case, one he had made sure to position himself at the center of. Cameras were in the gallery, local reporters scribbling notes. The timing was deliberate. Lowell had arranged for the warrant to be served during a live session, ensuring there would be no opportunity for Denton to quietly manipulate the narrative or escape behind closed doors. When the truth came out, it would come out for everyone to see. As the session began, Denton's voice rang steady. He spoke to the attorneys, cracked his gavel against the bench, and scolded a witness for failing to answer directly. To the untrained eye, he was in full command. But Lowell saw the cracks, the faint tremor in his hand as he shuffled papers, the slight delay when he adjusted his glasses. She wondered if he sensed what was about to happen, if somewhere beneath that practiced exterior he knew the walls were closing in. At precisely 10:47 a.m., the courtroom doors opened and two deputies entered. Their boots echoed sharply against the floor as they walked with purpose down the aisle. Reporters lifted their heads, pens pausing mid-sentence. Denton looked up, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. When the deputies reached the bench, the lead officer spoke clearly. "Judge Malcolm Denton, you are under arrest for the murder of your son, Ethan Denton." The room fell silent. Gasps erupted from the gallery. A journalist's camera clicked wildly. Denton froze, his face blanching. For a long moment, he didn't move, as though refusing to acknowledge the words. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark. "This is absurd," he declared, his voice booming. "I'm a judge of this court. Do you know who you're speaking to?" Lowell stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We know exactly who we're speaking to, Judge, and we know exactly what you did." She handed the warrant to the deputies, then fixed her eyes on Denton. The secrets from your own hard drive are now public, Judge. And we can prove it. The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters scrambled to their feet. Lawyers exchanged stunned looks. Denton's bravado faltered, his eyes darting from Lowell to the cameras to the jurors seated nearby. He tried to speak again, but the deputies moved quickly, pulling his hands behind his back, snapping the cuffs into place. The metallic clink echoed through the chamber like a gavel striking down the illusion of his innocence. Outside the courthouse, news vans were already lined up. The arrest, caught on camera, spread across social media within minutes. Judge arrested for murdering his own son. Hashtags trended nationwide. Hashtag justice for Ethan. Hashtag killer judge. Hashtag behind the rope. Talk shows cut into live coverage. National outlets picked up the story, spinning it as a grotesque tale of hypocrisy. A man who had condemned others for their sins while committing the darkest one of all in his own home. Meanwhile, Lowell presented the case at a press conference later that afternoon. She laid out the evidence carefully. The suicide note planted weeks in advance. The bruises inconsistent with self-harm. The scratches on Denton's arms. And most damning of all, the digital trail proving he uploaded his son's video. This was not a suicide, she told the cameras. This was a calculated murder, orchestrated by a man who believed he was untouchable. Today he is not. The nation recoiled. Denton's colleagues in the judiciary issued statements, distancing themselves, calling his actions a betrayal of justice. Politicians who once courted his endorsement scrambled to denounce him. The church where he had given sermons on morality fell eerily quiet, its pastors struggling to explain how they had allowed a murderer to preach among them. But for Ethan's friends and the LGBTQ+ community, the arrest was bittersweet. Marco, Ethan's boyfriend, wept during an interview, saying, "He told me his dad would do anything to protect himself. I just never thought it would be this." Activists turned Ethan into a symbol of the dangers faced by young people forced to hide who they are, particularly in families obsessed with image and reputation. Vigils were held across campuses, candles flickering as names of other LGBTQ+ youth lost to violence or rejection were read aloud. Inside his holding cell, Denton raged. He demanded special treatment, insisted the evidence was fabricated, accused Detective Lowell of a personal vendetta. But the evidence was airtight. Every denial only made him appear smaller, pettier, a man stripped of the authority he once wielded like a weapon. The robe was gone, the gavel silenced. What remained was just another defendant waiting to be tried. The final blow to his facade came when the recovered video files were revealed in court filings. The knowledge that he himself had stolen and uploaded his son's private video was too much for the public to stomach. The image of the grieving father shattered completely, replaced by that of a predator who had destroyed his own child to shield his ego. For Detective Lowell, the case was far from over. The trial would be long and grueling. But in that moment, as the world watched Malcolm Denton led away in chains, she felt the weight of justice shift. Ethan's voice, silenced in life, had spoken through the evidence, through the data his father thought could be erased. And the truth had finally been heard. What had begun as whispers of scandal in a small southern town was now a national reckoning. The story of Judge Denton wasn't just about a father killing his son. It was about the dangers of unchecked pride, of reputations built on lies, of the rot that festers when image matters more than love. And for the first time in his life, the man who once sat above everyone else found himself beneath the full weight of the law. The trial of Judge Malcolm Denton was unlike anything the state had seen in decades. The courthouse, once his kingdom, was now a theater of reckoning. Lines formed outside before dawn, reporters jostling for space beside protesters carrying signs that read justice for Ethan and no one above the law. Every day, the steps were crowded with cameras, activists, and curious onlookers hungry to witness the fall of the man who had once embodied untouchable authority. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The same wood-paneled courtroom where Denton had thundered judgments now held him as the accused. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially the jurors, ordinary citizens who had once feared his gaze from the bench. Now, they sat as arbiters of his fate. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Carlin Gwynn, wasted no time painting a devastating picture. "This is not the story of a grieving father," she said in her opening statement. "This is the story of a man who put his pride, his power, and his reputation above the life of his only child. A man who humiliated his son, orchestrated his downfall, and then killed him to bury the scandal he himself had created." She laid out the evidence methodically. The metadata proving the suicide note had been pre-written, the forensic analysis of the rope and bruises, the scratches on Denton's arms that matched Ethan's fingernails, and most damning of all, the digital trail leading from Denton's private study to the leaked sex tape. The jurors flinched as the raw video file appeared briefly on a screen. Not in full, but enough to confirm its origin and authenticity. It was Ethan's most vulnerable moment, weaponized by the man meant to protect him. Denton's defense tried to counter, framing him as a devastated father scapegoated by an ambitious detective. They argued the scratches on his arms came from his desperate attempt to cut Ethan down, that the digital evidence could have been tampered with. That grief made him inconsistent in his statements. Denton himself took the stand, a decision that stunned courtroom observers. "I love my son," he said, his voice cracking, though the performance felt rehearsed. "I would never hurt him. He was struggling, and I couldn't save him. Now they're trying to say I'm a monster because I stood for values they didn't like." For a brief moment, he almost seemed convincing. But under cross-examination, his facade fractured. Gwynn pressed him on the IP addresses, on the timing of the uploaded video, on the creation date of the note. Each question tightened the noose. "If you didn't write the note, Judge Denton, then why does the metadata show it was created on your account weeks before Ethan's death?" Silence. "If you didn't upload the video, Judge, then why was it traced to your study, your computer, your password?" Again, silence. The jury watched his face harden, the charm slipping away to reveal the cold arrogance beneath. Outside the courtroom, the case dominated national headlines. Talk shows dissected every detail. Podcasts released multi-part series on the killer judge. Hashtags like #JusticeForEthan trended alongside clips of Denton being led into court in shackles. To many, Ethan became more than a victim. He became a symbol. His story was invoked in debates about LGBTQ+ youth, about toxic family dynamics, about the devastating costs of repression and image obsession. Witnesses testified about Ethan's last weeks, his friends describing his determination to live authentically, Marco recounting Ethan's words, "I'm not going to let my dad win." Tears flowed in the gallery as those words were read aloud, a young man's defiance echoing even after death. The defense tried to cast doubt, but each attempt was dismantled. A digital forensics expert explained in painstaking detail how the deleted files were recovered, how the trail could not be fabricated. A medical examiner testified the strangulation marks were inconsistent with self-hanging. Lowell herself took the stand, describing the moment she realized the grieving father was also the killer. "The evidence didn't lie," she told the jury. "He did." The trial stretched for weeks, every detail scrutinized, every piece of evidence debated. But when the prosecution rested its case, the weight of proof felt overwhelming. Closing arguments sealed the narrative. Malcolm Denton thought his robe made him untouchable, Gwynn declared, her voice steady. He thought his pride mattered more than his son's life. But Ethan's voice was not silenced. It lives in the evidence. And today, you have the power to make sure justice is finally served. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice trembled as he read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cries, a few shouts of triumph. Denton sat stone-faced, staring straight ahead, as though refusing to acknowledge the words. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but the judge-turned-killer did not flinch. For a man who had spent his life dictating the fates of others, his own fate was now sealed. At sentencing, the judge presiding over the case, a colleague who had once looked up to Denton, spoke with quiet gravity. You were entrusted to uphold the law. Instead, you perverted it for your own pride. You betrayed your oath, your community, and most unforgivably, your son. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel fell. This time, it wasn't Denton's hand striking wood. It was the sound of justice closing in. In the aftermath, Denton's legacy collapsed. His past rulings were re-examined for bias. His political allies abandoned him. His name was stripped from civic buildings. The once proud patriarch of Southern conservatism became a cautionary tale, a symbol of hypocrisy and corruption. Ethan's memory, however, took on a different life. Vigils turned into movements. Scholarships were created in his name for LGBTQ+ law students. His story was told in documentaries, podcasts, and classrooms. What his father tried to erase became the very thing that ensured Ethan would never be forgotten. For Detective Lowell, the case remained etched in her mind. She had seen many forms of darkness, but few as chilling as a father who killed his son to protect his reputation. Yet, as she watched candles flicker at a vigil months later, she felt a quiet certainty. He thought he silenced him. She whispered, but Ethan will always be heard. In the weeks after the verdict, the Denton case became less about the man in shackles and more about the echoes he left behind. Across the state, people gathered at vigils holding Ethan's photo, smiling, alive, remembered not as the scandal his father tried to manufacture, but as a young man who wanted nothing more than to live freely. The courthouse steps that had once symbolized Judge Denton's power now bore flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. We see you, Ethan. We honor you. National media didn't let the story fade. Talk shows invited LGBTQ+ advocates to discuss the dangers of families prioritizing reputation over love. Podcasts dissected the trial in chilling detail, drawing millions of listeners. Hashtags like #JusticeForEthan and #InTheSilence trended repeatedly, sparking debates about toxic masculinity, parental control, and the real risks faced by queer youth in conservative homes. What began as whispers in a small southern town had become a national reckoning. The legal community faced its own reckoning. Judges who had once called Denton a colleague now had to confront the rot festering in their ranks. His cases were re-examined, his harsh rulings on LGBTQ+ defendants called into question. For many, the scandal was more than one man's crime. It was a mirror reflecting systemic prejudice. Denton had hidden his cruelty behind a robe, but the prejudice that fueled it wasn't his alone. For Ethan's friends and his boyfriend Marco, the grief remained raw. He was supposed to outlive all this, Marco said in a televised interview, his voice breaking. He wanted to prove his father wrong. Instead, his father proved just how dangerous hate can be. Their pain became part of a larger call for change, echoed by student groups, campus organizations, and national advocacy networks. Ethan's story turned into fuel for movements demanding stronger protections and resources for queer youth. Inside prison, Denton withered. Stripped of his title, his robes, and his gavel, he was just another inmate serving life without parole. The irony was brutal. A man who had judged others for decades now lived under constant judgment, powerless and forgotten. His name, once synonymous with authority, became shorthand for hypocrisy. But the final chapter didn't belong to him. It belonged to Ethan. Scholarships were created in his name, giving young LGBTQ+ students the chance to study law, the career Ethan had once dreamed of before it was stolen from him. Documentaries chronicled his story, not as sensational scandal, but as a lesson in the cost of silence and the dangers of unchecked pride. His voice, though silenced by his father's hands, lived on through every candlelit vigil, every whispered prayer, every young person who saw his story and felt less alone. As one activist said during a televised memorial, Judge Denton wanted his son forgotten. Instead, Ethan became unforgettable. And perhaps that is the cruelest twist of all. The man who murdered a child to save his legacy ensured that the only legacy people would remember was the son he tried to erase.